This episode, as always, brought to you by the wonderful folks who give to the show on patreon.com/queersplaining. This show wouldn't be what it is without your support, so thank you and I love you. My name is Callie Wright, and this is Queersplaining. So, lots of things that go viral on the internet are angry, and lots of them rightfully so. Twitter loves them a good takedown. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy them myself from time to time, but every once in a while, the internet gives you something wholesome. Once in a while, that wholesome thing, believe it or not, comes from Twitter. And this week, boy, do I have a good one for you.
My name is Joe. I am a gay man. I am 40 years old. I live in Chicago, Illinois with my husband. And I recently rose very, very briefly to Twitter fame with a story that was retweeted by Nicole Cliff about a time when I worked in a queer bookstore about 20 years ago. And I guess I will just very briefly go on a tangent to say that I'm surprised that there are so many people responding to my story on Twitter and Reddit and Facebook who are just sort of baffled by this concept. So I will say that 20 years ago, there were lots of small independent bookshops. There are still many great independent bookshops, especially here in Chicago. I think I got myself in a little bit of trouble by suggesting that that is not a business that exists anymore, and it very much is. But boy, 20 years ago, they were much more prevalent, and these stores, you would find them kind of in every major city, and they are both bookstores where you can just, buy a physical print book, but also very much resource centers. And we sold pride flags, and we were a space for local artists to put up their work and for local musicians to sell their CDs, because CDs used to be the way that you listen to music. And it's a place for people to drop in and meet people. And we would host open mic nights, and we tried to do game nights a couple times, and that didn't quite take off like we'd hoped. But just a place for people to sort of come and to meet one another. And it's true, too, that back then, I mean, even just the books was a big part of it, because sure, there were big bookstores, Barnes & Noble and Borders were around, but even if they had a gay and lesbian section, it just wasn't as involved or as detailed as the sort of stuff that we carried. And so this is the job that I had as I worked at this store. And it was a smaller store. I mean, the retail space of it wasn't much bigger than like a good-sized living room. And I am working at the bookstore one evening and took a phone call from a gentleman who it took a little while to get to the point. I mean, we chatted for just a minute, asked if he'd reached the right business, and then asked if we were located downtown. And, of course we were. I should say I live now in Chicago. I was living at the time in Indianapolis, Indiana. So that's where this story takes place. And he just asked a few questions, and with some pauses while he was kind of maybe working up the nerve to jump into this whole narrative. But that wasn't a very long conversation. And then he finally kind of came to say that he thought that he was probably gay, but he wasn't sure how you even determine this, but he knew that he'd been having this sort of feelings, and he was really stressed about it. And he was in a place where I felt pretty quickly into the call like he might even be a person who's going to hurt himself if he didn't sort of come to terms with this. I remember thinking that I just couldn't let him hang up the phone, because if he put the phone down, then I would never hear from him again, and that he might do something that we would both regret. And so he asked a few sort of basic questions. He asked, like, when I came out, he asked how that went. We talked about, my story. And I know that as I was telling this story, because I just didn't know what else to do, I know that I was becoming frantic, nervous. I know that I had a lot of vested interest in keeping him on the phone, and I am sure that I was pacing a little bit behind the counter. And because it was a small store, the other customers who were in the store could hear my end of the conversation, not his, but mine. And I think from the context, it was pretty clear pretty early on the sort of conversation that we were having, if not precisely with whom. And so I was talking to this guy, and I was running out of things to say, and I guess I wasn't sure exactly how to proceed. And in addition to being really invested in sort of keeping this guy on the phone, because I felt like that was important, I also was aware that it's still a business and there are people in the store, and I kept kind of looking back at the folks who were browsing and thinking, if somebody's got a question or if they need help, I'm not sure how I can manage to serve both of these goals at the same time. One of the women who was in the store approached me, and when she first came up to the counter, I thought she was going to need retail help. I thought she was going to ask to find a particular book, or and I just wasn't sure. I was really nervous that I wasn't going to be able to help both of them. She said, let me have a turn, and which after a second of sort of, coming to understand that she knew what was going on, I let her have the phone. And then she talked to this guy, and she had her story to tell, and she talked about her coming out story and the sort of lesson that she was there. And she had come into the store with a couple friends, and they came up to the front of the store with her. And after she talked to this guy for a little while, she said, I want to put another friend of mine on the phone. And the next customer in the store got on the phone and talked to this guy. And then there was one other gentleman in the store who did not come in with these women, but became aware of what was happening, and we asked him if he wanted, or if he would be willing to take a turn, and he got on the phone with this guy, and we just sort of shared with each other by way of this stranger on the phone our sort of unique queer experiences, and I feel like left him with a positive sense of what it's like to be part of a community. I can tell you that just from my personal standpoint, that this is a story that I reflect on a lot. It just reminds me of how good we are to each other. I think the gay community, I know that sometimes there are times when we are not the best to each other. And I know I have friends who sometimes talk about how problematic sometimes the gay community can be to each other, but I also know that there's so much love and support there. I feel like I've seen over the years so many people look out for each other and offer people support and places to live and money and visiting each other when you're sick in the hospital. And I feel like I've seen so much good, and I sort of think back to this story as the kind of maybe the pinnacle of that moment, or at least the time that for the first time it really hit me as a young gay person that we were all really looking out for each other. There's no postscript to this story. It would be lovely if he had come in, a month later and said, "Oh, you talked to me on the phone," but no, I'm afraid I never heard back from that guy. I definitely like to think that he is doing well. I hope for that for him. I started telling the story on Twitter. The prompt that sort of got us there was, what's the kindest thing a stranger has ever done for you? And I don't want to take at all away from what this woman and these people did for that man on the phone, because it absolutely is a beautiful thing. But really, when I saw that prompt, the first thing I thought of is what a kind thing these people had done for me. On my side of that conversation was getting a little frantic and a little nervous for this guy, and I just didn't know this thing to do. And I feel like she was really there to sort of support me in the time when I really needed it. And that's how I think of that story, is that kindness that she showed me. So unfortunately, I don't have an epilogue with that guy, or even with her. I can't say that I ever saw her again either. One of the women that she came in with, one of her friends, was back in the store a couple more times. I remember seeing her come through, but we didn't catch up or hey, you remember that time that we were all on the phone, and we didn't talk about it too much after the fact. But I know she remembered who I was. I certainly remembered who she was.
There are no saviors, my friends. We are the ones we're waiting on. When someone needed help, Joe stepped up to the plate. And when Joe needed help, a stranger took over. Then it was someone else's turn. It's not a perfect model by any stretch. This anonymous person who called into a bookstore should have had a resource center to call, a hotline, something. These systems need to exist, but in that vacuum, sometimes some kind soul steps up and decides to become that thing. But none of us can shoulder those burdens alone. If you're able, I'd like to encourage you to be that for someone else. Monumental feats of activism and internet snark aren't always necessary. Sometimes all that's needed is to just be kind. Take care of yourselves and each other, my friends. If you want to help support the show, share this episode around to your friends. Think you know someone who'd love the show? Unless you're driving, stop what you're doing right now and send them a text. Tell them to subscribe to Queersplaining and tell them they need it in their lives. And if you're driving, just wait to get where you're going, please. Every share helps, and it all makes a difference. If you're able, check out patreon.com/queersplaining and consider a pledge to support the show. It's the reason why I'm able to keep doing what I do. Thank you, friends. Before I go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, my name is Callie Wright, and this is Queersplaining.